The reliability of the New Testament as a historical and religious text hinges significantly on how closely our modern copies reflect the original writings. Evangelical scholars and theologians often point to the remarkable preservation of the New Testament's text, supported by thousands of ancient manuscripts, as evidence of its fidelity to the originals. It's argued that this vast manuscript tradition, combined with rigorous textual criticism, entails that the New Testament we read today is a reliably close approximation of what was first penned by its authors, bolstering claims of its historical and doctrinal trustworthiness. But is this actually the case? Is the New Testament we have today faithful to the originals, or is it instead saturated in ambiguity and corruption? The New Testament is the focal point of the Christian faith. Without the New Testament, you have no Paul, no Jesus, no death on the cross, and no resurrection. These 27 books are a crucial part of the foundation that Christians rest their faith upon. But exactly how solid is this foundation? Is there strong justification for the claim that the New Testament we have today accurately and faithfully reflects the original documents? New Testament scholar Daniel B. Wallace sure thinks so. In his book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament, he states, "The New Testament text is in far better shape than virtually any other ancient document. We can have confidence that the New Testament we have today is essentially the same as what was originally written." The late New Testament scholar Philip W. Comfort agrees with Wallace. In his book, New Testament Text and Translation Commentary, he states, "The vast majority of the New Testament text has been preserved with remarkable fidelity. The thousands of manuscripts and early versions provide a solid basis for reconstructing the original text. Textual critics have been able to recover a text that is very close to the original autographs." Comfort is right about one thing. We do have thousands of New Testament manuscripts, around 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts to be more precise. That's a lot of manuscripts. In fact, it's the largest number of manuscripts for any work from antiquity, and a large number of manuscripts make it easier for textual critics to cross-reference and root out textual variants in order to reconstruct the original. However, we should not prematurely infer the reliability of the New Testament text from the sheer volume of manuscripts. For one thing to keep in mind is that not all manuscripts are created equal. Later manuscripts are less valuable and less telling than their earlier counterparts. The earlier the manuscript, the closer it reflects the original, and therefore the more it is prioritized. And this is where the New Testament manuscripts run into a major problem. For only approximately 100 manuscripts are dated to before 400 AD. And many of these manuscripts are tiny fragments which contain only a few verses or passages. This means that a mere 1.7% of our Greek New Testament manuscripts date to within 300 years of the originals. Conversely, approximately 4,500 to 5,000 of these manuscripts come from 1000 AD and beyond. This means that anywhere from 78 to 86% of our Greek New Testament manuscripts come an entire millennium after the originals. So it seems that the number of 5,800 manuscripts is not quite as impressive as it initially sounds when we take into account the actual proportion regarding how many of these manuscripts are early and useful for scholars in determining the original text. Now, more importantly, why is a lack of substantive early manuscripts an issue for the reliability of the New Testament text? Well, for the simple reason that errors or alterations in early copies are much harder to detect than in later copies. Here's New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman to explain.
Let's say Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians, and they got a copy. And then somebody made a copy of that original, and made a couple mistakes, and then somebody copied that copy, made a few mistakes. And then the original was lost, and the first copy was lost, and that all other manuscripts ultimately derive from that third copy. In other words, that third copy was, the original wasn't copied anymore, the first copy wasn't copied anymore, only the second copy was copied twice, and both of those was copied 5 times, and each of those was copied 20 times, and so that they all go back in a genealogical line to the third copy, rather than to the original. All you can reconstruct is what was in the third copy. And all manuscripts, when they agree, 95% of the time, or whatever number you want to put on it, when they agree 95% of the time, that just shows that they all go back to that copy. It doesn't show they go back to the original.
Let's further elucidate Ehrman's argument. Imagine Paul's original letter to the Philippians is copied by a scribe. We'll call this the second copy, and that this scribe makes a few mistakes. Subsequently, another scribe copies this second mistaken copy and produces a third copy, and this scribe also makes a few additional mistakes of their own. Now suppose that the original and second copy are lost, and only the third copy remains, and suppose that more and more copies are made, as well as copies of these copies, and so on. This entails that all subsequent manuscripts will derive only from the third copy, which is not 100% faithful to the original because it contains errors. This further entails that all the textual criticism of those subsequent manuscripts will not possibly reconstruct the original, but will only reconstruct the third copy that has errors. And notice that in this scenario, we're only assuming that the scribes made typical and innocuous errors like misspellings or accidental omissions, as opposed to intentional alterations and interpolations. But we know that scribes many times did in fact alter the text and add interpolations. We know of entire passages in the New Testament that have been dishonestly added in by scribes. The entire ending of the Gospel of Mark, verses 9 through 20, is a known interpolation. There are actually no narratives of the resurrected Jesus appearing to anyone in Mark. In the Gospel of John, the story of the woman caught in adultery in chapter 8 is missing from our earliest manuscripts and in fact shows up in later manuscripts in different chapters of the Gospel. It's one of the most well-known and often quoted pericopes of the Gospels, and yet we know that it's an interpolation. In 1 John chapter 5, one of the verses that most explicitly elucidates and articulates the Trinity is also a known interpolation. There are 2 different versions of the book of Acts in our manuscript tradition as well. There exists a Western version and an Alexandrian version, and the former is around 10% longer than the latter. Scholars are confident that the Alexandrian version is closer to the original. Nevertheless, the fact that a book from the New Testament can vary by a degree as high as 10% is shocking, and should make those who argue for the reliability of the New Testament text uneasy. For what if we didn't have the manuscripts from the Alexandrian version? What if we didn't have the 3 manuscripts that don't contain the long ending of Mark? Or the few manuscripts of the Gospel of John that are missing the adultery pericope? If we didn't have these small handful of manuscripts, we'd be unsuspectedly holding to whole swaths of scripture that were unknowingly corrupt and fraudulent. So consider this. We do in fact know that the New Testament text is corrupt. The question is, to what degree has it been corrupted? All of this brings us to a major issue that should cause one to seriously doubt any semblance of New Testament reliability, and that's the following. We're still missing mountains of manuscripts from the first few centuries of textual transmission. And for instance, if only 3 manuscripts stand in the way of affirming the entire ending of the Gospel of Mark, then how many more manuscripts are we missing that would shed light on other interpolations and corruptions of the text? We simply don't know. Another crucial piece of the puzzle is this. The error rates in the transmission of the New Testament text are higher the farther back we go. So not only are we missing tons of manuscripts during the most crucial time of textual transmission, but this same time period is also when the rates of corruption are the highest. You see, during the first few centuries of textual transmission, the Christian movement was still a relatively small, often persecuted religious group within the Roman Empire. Unlike later periods when Christianity became the state religion under Constantine and professional scriptoria or copying centers were established, early Christian texts were copied in a decentralized and informal manner by non-professional scribes. There was no unified church structure to oversee the production and distribution of text. Christian communities were scattered across regions like Judea, Asia Minor, Greece, and Egypt, and each community often produced its own copies of the New Testament writings for local use. This created a breeding ground for the proliferation of errors and alterations to the text. New Testament scholars Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman, in their book The Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration, note, during the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, the church was not yet sufficiently organized to exercise control over the copying of its sacred books. The production of copies was generally left to individual Christians or to small groups, who often worked under difficult circumstances, such as persecution. They continue, during the first 2 centuries of its transmission, the text of the New Testament was copied under conditions that were far less controlled than in later periods. The lack of professional scribes and the absence of a fixed canon meant that interpolations, whether accidental omissions filled in by scribes or intentional additions to clarify doctrine, were more likely to occur in this formative period than after the church established greater oversight in the 4th century. So not only did the circumstances of the early church make scribes more likely to make mistakes or additions, we know for a fact that during this period there were more mistakes and additions. Textual critic Eldon J. Epp notes, the early papyri such as P45, P46, and P66 exhibit a freer approach to copying with a higher incidence of errors and corrections, reflecting the work of less skilled scribes compared to the more controlled copying of later codices like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. One point to highlight as well here is that even church fathers had noticed this issue in real time, with scribes either unintentionally or deliberately altering the text. The 3rd century church father Origen of Alexandria, in his commentary on Matthew, stated, "It is clear that many differences in the copies have come about either from the lazy indifference of certain scribes or the misguided daring of others. They either neglect to check over what they have transcribed or, in the process of checking, add or subtract things according to their own opinion." Scholar of early Christianity Larry Hurtado addresses the potential for early interpolations in his book, The Earliest Christian Artifacts, Manuscripts, and Christian Origins. He states, in the first 2 centuries, the New Testament texts were copied in a context of considerable freedom, with little to constrain scribes from making changes, whether accidental or intentional. This environment likely led to a higher rate of interpolations during this period, as scribes might insert material to address local theological needs or to harmonize differing accounts, changes that would be harder to detect without early manuscripts for comparison. There you have it. The first few centuries of textual transmission had the highest rates of error and the most potential for interpolations and alterations. And yet this is the same time period for which we lack the copies needed to determine just exactly where these errors and interpolations took place. Without this information, we're completely in the dark regarding the extent of New Testament corruption. Again, textual criticism can't solve this problem if the errors and interpolations took place early enough such that all or most of the subsequent copies were affected. The absence of early manuscripts and originals, combined with a high error rate during this time, provides a reasonable basis for doubting the reliability of the New Testament as an unaltered record of first-century events and teachings. While textual criticism has made great strides in reconstructing the likely original text, the gap between the originals and our earliest copies, coupled with the higher rates of error during that gap, provide us with a more than justified skepticism. The New Testament is assuredly corrupt. The relevant question is, what is the extent of the corruption? The answer, it seems, is we just don't know. Thanks for watching.